He was supposed to be walking home. That was the explanation everyone accepted in 1999. That Justin Hocutt left a house in Seligman, Missouri, sometime before dawn, and made his way back toward his own front door. Less than a day later, his body was found on the railroad tracks, a short distance away. For years, investigators treated his death as something that had happened somewhere between that house and home. But the route did not make sense. Not the distance, not the direction, not the timing. That detail would remain one of the unanswered questions surrounding Justin's death for the next 27 years. Today's case is the murder of Justin Hocutt. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from tonight, and if you are new here, consider subscribing. Now, back to Seligman, Missouri, in the fall of 1999. Justin Hocutt was 14 years old, living in Seligman, a small town near the Arkansas line where most people knew each other by name. He was in school. He had a girlfriend, Katrina Johnson, who lived next door with her father and her 3 older stepbrothers, Mark, Bobby, and David Scott. By most accounts, Justin was an ordinary teenager doing an ordinary teenage thing, sneaking around to spend time with a girl he liked, without either family's full blessing. There is not a great deal of public record about who Justin was outside of the case that would eventually define him. What exists paints a boy who was, by every measure, unremarkable in the best sense of that word. He was not in trouble. He was not somewhere he was known to have no business being, except for the one night that mattered. He was a kid who fell asleep at his girlfriend's house and never got the chance to grow into whoever he might have become. That absence, the entire unlived rest of his life, is what makes cases like this one worth returning to, even decades later. The relationship between the two families is part of what made the case so difficult from the start. Two households, close enough that a teenager could walk from one to the other without needing a car or a plan, meant that whatever happened inside the Johnson and Scott residence that October morning was witnessed, at least in part, only by people who had every reason not to talk about it. On the night of October 8, 1999, Justin and Katrina fell asleep together on the living room floor of the Johnson and Scott residence. Sometime around 4 or 5 in the morning, Katrina's father, Harold Johnson, woke up and found them there. What should have been the end of the story, an angry father, an embarrassed boy sent home, was instead the beginning of it. According to the probable cause statement filed decades later, Harold confronted Justin, and the confrontation escalated quickly. Katrina's stepbrothers, Mark, Bobby, and David, all grown men in their 20s, were pulled into it. A witness inside the house would later tell investigators that the group beat Justin with a stick, and that at some point, a rope was placed around his neck. That same witness said the group could be heard discussing taking him to the tracks, as though the decision had already been made before the violence had even run its course. Investigators would later conclude that the boy's mother, Brenda Scott, took part as well, allegedly striking Justin with a stick of her own. That was the account that would emerge in the later investigation. In 1999, what investigators had instead was a boy who was simply gone. No one outside that house saw what happened in the living room that morning. What they had was a missing teenager, and later, an assumption about how he ended up where he was found. Justin did not come home that Saturday. His family made calls, first casual, then increasingly urgent. By the time law enforcement was formally notified, roughly 22 hours had passed since anyone outside the Johnson and Scott house had seen him alive. A search began around Seligman, the kind of door-to-door canvassing small departments rely on when there is no obvious lead to chase. Less than a day after he vanished, Justin's body was discovered on the railroad tracks near his home, a short distance from the very house where he had spent his last known hours. The tracks sat close to the residence, close enough that reaching them did not require a car or a plan, only a walk across the street. That proximity became part of the earliest explanation for how Justin ended up there. There was no evidence of drugs or alcohol involved. There was no indication he had any reason to have deliberately put himself in the train's path. Investigators were left with a body on the tracks and very little else to explain how he arrived there. So the explanation that filled the gap for years afterward was something closer to circumstance than certainty. He had left the house, and something happened on his way home. The railroad tracks explained where Justin died. They did not explain how he got there, and for a long time, no one pressed hard enough to close that gap. Even in 1999, that explanation had problems. Word moved fast through a town the size of Seligman, and within days, suspicion had already settled on 3 names: the Scott brothers. But because Justin's body was found on railroad property, jurisdiction over the death fell to railroad police rather than the Barry County Sheriff's Office, officers whose ordinary work involved trespassing and equipment theft, not homicide. During the exact window when memory was freshest and evidence was least likely to have been disturbed, the case moved through channels that were never built to handle it. That single early decision about which agency would run the investigation would shape the case for nearly 3 decades. There were early signs something did not add up. A witness later told investigators they saw Brenda Scott purchase 5 gallons of bleach in the days after Justin's body was found, and watched people inside the residence scrubbing the apartment in a way that had nothing to do with routine housekeeping. Before the week was out, the Scott family had moved out entirely. None of it, at the time, led to an arrest. The theory that Justin had simply left the house and met his death somewhere along the way to the tracks was never formally disproven. It was simply never fully tested, in part because the agency handling the case was not equipped to test it, and in part because a small town's suspicion, however widely shared, has never once been enough on its own to bring a charge. For the next several years, the case moved in fits and starts without ever producing charges. Investigators conducted interviews in the years that followed, revisiting the Scott brothers and people connected to the household, but nothing produced enough to bring before a prosecutor. Katrina Johnson, the one person who had been in the room when her father discovered her and Justin together, gave a statement, but she was struggling with addiction at the time, and the prosecuting attorney's office judged she would not hold up as a credible witness. An affidavit went nowhere. No charges were filed. By 2001, Justin's father, Timmy Hocutt, had grown convinced the system was never going to act, and that conviction turned violent. He shot and wounded both Mark and David Scott. It resolved nothing legally, and there is no record he was ever formally convicted for it. But it made unmistakably clear where suspicion in this case had always pointed, even without an arrest to back it up. After that, the file went quiet. Evidence remained in storage. Witnesses aged, moved away, and in some cases died without ever being asked again what they knew. The case did not disappear from Seligman's memory, but it stopped moving through any formal system for the better part of 2 decades. Interviews conducted in the years that followed, in 2009, in 2010, in 2011, added detail without ever producing a case a prosecutor was willing to file. The physical evidence stayed exactly where it had been logged in 1999, untouched by any of the forensic advances that would eventually matter so much. By 2020, the case was more than 2 decades old. But the file had not disappeared, and when Danny Boyd became sheriff of Barry County that year, it was reportedly one of the first old cases he pulled. Reviewing it, he and his investigators identified significant deficiencies in how it had originally been handled, gaps that needed to be addressed almost from scratch. Old reports were reviewed, witnesses who had scattered over the years needed to be located again, and information that had simply been carried forward from the original file for 2 decades needed independent verification rather than being taken at face value. By the sheriff's own account, the effort would eventually take hundreds of hours. That effort stayed largely out of public view until February 2026, when a regional television program covering unsolved cases in the Ozarks featured Justin's story. It was a short segment, but for a file that had sat untouched since the early 2000s, it mattered. Sheriff Boyd would later credit the broadcast with helping push the case back to the top of his department's priorities, not because it revealed new evidence on air, but because it put the story back in front of the exact community that had been quietly carrying it for so long. Somewhere in Seligman, someone who had stayed silent for decades was watching. By May 2026, the case was officially reopened. The Missouri State Highway Patrol's Division of Drug and Crime Control joined the effort, and evidence from 1999 was resubmitted to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Laboratory for additional laboratory examination. That was one piece of what finally began to answer the question the original investigation never fully pursued. What actually happened between the house and the tracks? Alongside the laboratory work, investigators went back and re-interviewed nearly everyone still living who had any connection to that night, sitting across kitchen tables with people who had spent much of their adult lives trying not to think about that October morning. Some of what they found only deepened the tragedy of how long it had taken to get there. Both Brenda Scott and Harold Johnson, the two adults alleged to have taken part in the assault alongside the three brothers, had died before charges were ever filed, taking whatever complete account they carried with them. Several other witnesses from the original investigation were gone as well. The case had been reopened in time to prosecute the brothers, but not in time to hold everyone who may have been involved accountable, and not in time to spare certain witnesses from having to revisit that night one final time before they died without seeing it resolved. What emerged from the renewed investigation came largely from witnesses, and it helps to separate what different accounts actually established rather than treating every statement as interchangeable. One group of accounts described what allegedly happened inside the house itself, the confrontation between Harold Johnson and Justin, the stepbrothers being pulled into it, the beating with a stick, the rope. A second group of accounts described what happened after, the alleged decision to move Justin toward the tracks while the assault was apparently still being discussed. A third group concerned what people allegedly said or did in the aftermath, including statements witnesses say they heard from those involved in the years that followed, long before investigators formally came calling again. And a fourth category was physical rather than testimonial. The reported bleach purchase and the cleaning inside the residence, evidence that is suggestive of a cover-up but is not, on its own, proof of what happened to Justin. Grouping the evidence this way is not simply an organizational choice. Each category carries a different weight in a courtroom. What a witness says they saw happen inside a living room in 1999 is direct testimony, subject to cross-examination about memory and reliability nearly 3 decades later. What a witness says someone else told them years afterward is a different kind of evidence entirely, and physical details like a bleach purchase or a hurried move are circumstantial, useful for building a picture but not, standing alone, proof of anything. One witness, identified in court filings only as witness number 1 to protect their safety, reportedly told others over the years what they knew, long before this case was ever reopened. At the center of the renewed investigation sits one forensic question, and it may be the single most important detail in the entire case. Was Justin already dead by the time he reached the tracks? The original 1999 handling of the case appears to have proceeded on the assumption that he was, which shaped how urgently, or how loosely, the case was pursued for years afterward. When Berry County investigators went back through that same autopsy material decades later, the probable cause statement indicates a different conclusion was reached, that Justin was still alive when he was placed on the tracks, and that he was struck by a passing train while still breathing. It is worth being precise here. The complete original autopsy report has not been made public, and what is available comes through investigators' summary in charging documents rather than the medical record itself. That distinction matters because it is the difference between reporting what prosecutors allege the evidence shows and claiming direct knowledge of a medical finding that has not been independently released. But if the allegation holds, it changes everything about how this case is understood. Because a body already dead when it reaches a set of tracks tells one story, and a body still breathing when someone chooses to leave it there tells a very different one. Investigators say Justin was confronted inside the residence after being discovered with Katrina. An assault allegedly followed, involving Harold Johnson, the 3 Scott brothers, and allegedly their mother. Investigators allege he was then incapacitated and moved toward the railway rather than left where the confrontation occurred. The later investigation therefore rejected the earlier walking home explanation. That reconstruction raised an obvious next question. Who, specifically, was responsible? The probable cause materials do not describe identical roles for all 3 Scott brothers. David Ray Scott, 49 years old at the time of his arrest, is the brother for whom the most detailed allegations have been made publicly available, and he is the one who was arraigned first, entering a not guilty plea. Beyond the murder charge, his only prior conviction on record is for driving while intoxicated. Mark Wesley Scott, 46 years old, has a record that includes prior convictions for domestic assault and drug possession, along with a terroristic threat charge, though the publicly available material gives less specific detail about his individual alleged actions on the night in question than it does for David. Bobby Ray Scott, 48 years old, carries the most serious prior record of the three, including a 2005 conviction for statutory rape and statutory sodomy, along with drug and theft convictions. Like Mark, the public record is less specific about his exact role that night, even though he faces the same first-degree murder charge. That distinction matters. All three brothers are charged with the same crime, but the evidence tying each of them individually to specific actions inside that house is not, from what has been made public, identical. A jury will ultimately be asked to weigh each man's alleged conduct on its own terms, not simply to treat three co-defendants as an interchangeable group, and the strength of the case against each of them may look different once it reaches that stage. That is one of the realities a documentary account of an active case has to hold on to. The same charge does not always mean the same evidence, and a fair account of this case means resisting the urge to flatten three separate men into a single villain. The arrests themselves happened quickly, in the final week of July 2026. On July 23rd and 24th, Barry County authorities charged all three brothers with first-degree murder. David was taken into custody in Barry County itself and booked without bond. Mark and Bobby were arrested roughly 200 miles away in Pulaski County, Arkansas, on fugitive warrants, men who had spent nearly 3 decades building lives in another state before that October night finally caught up to them. Mark waived extradition. Bobby did not, meaning prosecutors would need up to 60 days to secure a governor's warrant for his return. David was arraigned on July 27th and pleaded not guilty, with a bond hearing scheduled for August 12th before Judge Robert Falk. The day after David's arraignment, Sheriff Boyd stood before reporters alongside his investigative team and the Barry County Prosecutor's Office to explain publicly what had taken years to build privately. He acknowledged the failures of the original 1999 investigation directly, an unusual thing for a sheriff to say about his own department's history, and it was, in its own way, as much a part of this case's ending as the arrests themselves, an admission that the system had not done right by this family for a very long time. Standing alongside him were the investigators who had spent hundreds of hours rebuilding the file, and the county's prosecuting attorney, whose office would now carry the case forward into court. It is worth saying plainly what an arrest is and is not. Charges are not convictions. A probable cause statement is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What the arrests represent is a case investigators believe is now strong enough to test in court, not a case that has already been proven there. And there is a great deal this case still does not answer. Why the confrontation escalated as violently as it allegedly did remains unclear. Exactly what happened inside that house, moment by moment, is still built largely from witness memory rather than physical reconstruction. Who physically carried or moved Justin toward the tracks, and whether all three brothers played an equal role in that decision, has not been laid out in identical detail for each defendant. The full autopsy findings that reportedly support the claim that Justin was alive when he reached the tracks have not been made public. Why the original 1999 investigation accepted the walking home explanation for as long as it did, without ever seriously testing it against the physical layout of the scene, is a question the department itself has now publicly acknowledged but not fully answered. There is also the matter of witness number 1, whose account reportedly circulated informally for years before investigators formally documented it. How that account holds up, whether it is corroborated by other evidence, and how a defense attorney will approach testimony built on decades-old memory, are all questions a courtroom will have to work through in far more detail than any charging document can offer. And there is the harder question hanging over any case built this late. How reliable can witness memory be, after almost 3 decades? And how will that memory hold up under cross-examination in a courtroom, rather than an interview room? Justin's family lived with all of these unanswered questions for longer than most people could imagine sitting with anything. His aunt spoke publicly in the days surrounding the arrests describing a hope that had never fully faded, even after decades of disappointment. For years, what they had was memory. A boy who was 14 and would stay 14, in every photograph, in every story told about him, while the world around that memory kept moving forward without him. They watched suspects age, move away, and in 2 cases die, without ever facing a courtroom. They watched a system that had, by its own sheriff's later admission, failed to give this case what it needed from the very first hour. For 27 years, that family lived in the same small stretch of the Ozarks as the people they believed were responsible for Justin's death, watching them raise families of their own, watching them move freely through the same towns, the same stores, the same roads that ran past the tracks where Justin died. That is a particular kind of endurance, one that does not show up in a probable cause statement or a press conference, and it is worth remembering as part of what this case actually cost the people who loved him. When the arrests finally came in July 2026, they did not bring certainty, and they did not bring justice. Not yet. What they brought was movement, the first the family had felt in decades. 3 men have been charged. They have not been convicted. The state still has to prove what happened inside that house, and who did what, to a jury, beyond a reasonable doubt. The motive has never been publicly established, the investigation remains open, and additional charges are still possible. What the charges create is not an ending. They create a place where the evidence can finally be tested. In a courtroom, under rules that did not exist for this family in any real form until now. The question this case opened with was simple. What happened between the house and the railway? For most of that time, the only answer available was an assumption that never quite fit the distance, the timing, or the route. Justin Hocutt was 14 years old. His family never got the chance to watch him grow older. After 27 years, they may finally get the chance to hear what happened to him. Cold cases like Justin's are often reopened because someone refuses to let the unanswered questions disappear. If you want to follow more cases like this, subscribe to Just Crime Talks and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for watching.